Good evening, one and all, and welcome to Cool Animators and How They Shaped Anime. Tonight we are going to be talking about cool animators and how they shaped anime. Specifically, we are going to be talking about the techniques and approaches which animators working within the Japanese animation industry have developed over the years, and how it has shaped the thing which we all know and love. Well, at the very least, we all know it. And I do specifically mean the animators. I do not mean directors or writers or background artists. I mean specifically the people who produce the drawings which are then shown in sequence and by so doing produce motion, the animators. And you may observe that this is a little bit of an esoteric thing to be talking about because on the one hand, if we're talking about technique in general, well, that might be interesting as a curiosity, but that's a very technical sort of thing to be talking about, isn't it? Interesting to somebody who wants to become an animator, but not necessarily to you. But on the other hand, if we're talking about individual animators, well, that might be interesting as a curiosity, but it's far too atomic to perhaps sustain interest for much more than that, especially if you are used to thinking about people like writers and directors as being the primary autorial unit in thinking about anime critically. I would actually maintain that discussing the animation anime is neither of these things. I would maintain that this is something that is of great interest to a very wide variety of different anime fans. The best illustration of why I believe this is actually a post that I found on Tumblr a few years ago of a bunch of, I hesitate to even say anime fan, just a bunch of Miyazaki fans talking about something interesting they observed in a GIF of Ponyo. They observe, I believe rightly, that there is something interesting about, in their words, the water physics in Studio Ghibli movies. They observe that the water in those movies tends to be gelatinous. It behaves in defiance of things like surface tension and gravity. It's not necessarily realistic, but it captures something about how water intuitively feels. And this in turn contributes materially to the atmosphere in certain scenes, and by extension to why they like the scenes that they like. For instance, the scene of Chihiro eating the onigiri in Spirited Away, or Jiro Horikoshi hanging out under the umbrella with his girlfriend, whose name I forget. Sorry about that. And in turn, this is not for nothing, because the atmosphere in these films is an important part of why people like them as much as they do, as evidenced by the fact that the post almost immediately descends into the same bromides that posts about Studio Ghibli movies usually descend into, that they're cozy and nostalgic, and things that I wouldn't necessarily use to describe a Studio Ghibli oeuvre in general, but that's neither here nor there, because after all, the coziness of certain scenes in certain movies is a very important part of the image of Studio Ghibli, and that image exists because that is a very important aspect of Studio Ghibli movies that people really enjoy. And I mean, goodness, who wouldn't want to live in the world of Kiki's Delivery Service? Society actually functions in that movie. It's a utopia of sorts, but that is a very different argument from the sort of argument that I want to make to you tonight. This is not a Kiki's Delivery Service panel, even though it could be. Um, we could even just talk about the animation Kiki's Delivery Service. So the theses of this panel are three in number. The first one is that the aesthetics of anime are an important part of why people like it. This is evident, especially the further back in anime fandom you go. If you ask somebody from the 90s or 80s why they like anime, the thing that they will tell you almost to a person is that it doesn't look like Disney. It doesn't look like Hanna-Barbera. It doesn't look like Fleischer Brothers. It doesn't look like Warner Brothers. It only ever looks like anime. Second thesis is that animation is a visual medium, and it shouldn't be surprising really at all to discover that the way animators animate in Japan has shaped its development in as a visual medium in Japan. The third thesis is that animation is interesting even divorced of narrative considerations as a art form unto itself. Even though there are certainly technological reasons why animation only began to exist at the turn of the 20th century, there is no particular artistic reason why it had to be this way. There is nothing logically against the idea that romantic painters in the 1800s might have used animation to try to capture the violence and majesty of a storm at sea rather than trying to capture it in paintings, or why nobles didn't try to get animated portraiture of themselves, or why certain artists didn't try to use animation to capture ballroom scenes. These are all things that are technically and practically impossible, but there is certainly a part of me that would be curious to do an investigation of different art scenes throughout history and thinking about how they might be different if animation were a plausible form of expression at that time.